Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last but not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You will find what you're looking for. It's inevitable. You are listening to Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix, the family-friendly podcast where we logically speculate on life. The only trigger warning for this episode is a logical conversation, so if logic upsets you, turn off the podcast now. And I'm also going to add in here as well, please like and subscribe if you're listening to us on YouTube, because that just helps us out with generating traction and helps us keep doing these podcasts here that we're doing. And I'm going to kick it off to Trace for our fish fact of the day. How are you doing today, Trace?
I am good. So, fish fact. Some sharks and rays have a type of milk, and it tastes like sweetened condensed milk.
Okay, I don't know how to respond to that one, but that one's keeping me on my toes there. I like it. All right. I mean, we have all of these mammals and all these sea creatures that produce milk, and we're still trying to make milk out of nuts. I mean, I don't know.
It's not really like a milk per se, but it's just something like milk.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, you give me a second here. I'm getting some quick technical difficulties. Oh yeah, that's actually something I'm going to hit on from the last podcast as well, because there was one point in there where we had you cut out for a minute, and I said that I was going to edit that out, and I never did. So I think that's just kind of be the general podcast policy, is we're going to do minimal edits to the show here and keep it as authentic and genuine as we can, with all of our mistakes included, because we're not perfect and we don't want anyone to think that we're perfect. Well, maybe you do. I don't.
I mean, I could go either or.
Fair enough. So I'm also going to clarify something about trigger warnings, because I did mention that here in the intro, and that's something I want to expand upon for our ground rules from the last episode, where we said we were going to try to avoid, family unfriendly topics and everything like that. But certain things like Greek mythology, they're going to have certain conversations in it that might not be as family friendly, things that include the R word and stuff. And so my longer term vision is that we're going to do the best we can to include any trigger warnings of stuff like that in the beginning of the episode, so that you as the listener know, hey, I need to, if this is a sensitive subject for me, or I have little kids, little ears listening, and I don't want them to hear XYZ topic, that way to turn it off. We might not always catch everything, but we're certainly going to do the best that we can. So this section here of the show, let's just do a couple quick follow-ups from the last. That one was kind of a follow-up there. I realized as well, listening to the last episode, that I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about my faith struggles and everything, and how I explored the idea of God outside of a Christian perspective and ultimately came back to believing in the God of the Bible. And I said I was going to do that the last episode, and I never did. So we're going to come back and address that in this episode here. And I'm just going to give kind of a cursory explanation stuff. And Trace, if you want to have a conversation on this, we certainly can. But for me, I kind of set aside the Bible and everything when I was exploring my faith. And I said, okay, what can I, using just logic, reason, understanding, and looking at the universe as it is, what can I infer about the creator? Is there even a creator? What would that be? And I was able to look at it and be like, okay, well, first off, there has to be an infinite mover, because as Newton's first law is that an object at rest tends to stay at rest until enacted on by an outside force, right? So there has to, for the universe to kickstart, there had to be some kind of infinite mover. There had to be some being of infinite power to start things. By requirement as well, this being would have to be separate or outside of the universe, because the universe, at least to my knowledge and my consistency, could not have created itself either. That also means that this being would also have to be outside of time. It would have to be some kind of an infinite being. And then as well, looking at kind of how we're structured as people, it would have to be a good being. And it couldn't be a bad being. It couldn't be a good and bad are synonymous with each other. And that was kind of the route initially went down. It's like, okay, well, maybe it's just, an impersonal force or something that, it's neutral on both good and bad. But then if good and bad are neutral, then you end up where choosing something good or choosing something bad would be no different than saying, I want apple juice or orange juice for breakfast. And that's just not the case. We might disagree on the nuances of what's good or what's bad as humankind as a whole, but when you actually boil down the specifics of it all, we have a general defined outline of what's right and what's wrong. So all of those kind of constraints and everything, I kind of realized, setting aside the Bible, I was able to look at and see what all this meant for life. And that was a factor into leading me back into Christianity. But that was kind of my thought process and my whole flow. So you have anything you want to add to that, Trace, or any thoughts? Any snide remarks?
None that I can think of right now.
All right, fair enough. Next thing was you had sent me a meme that was talking about church signs. Do you want to explain that one to us a little bit, or you want me to do that?
Honestly, I can't even. It was like a collage of a bunch of church signs, and it was just generally stuff that I disagreed with. I can't remember really any of the specifics. Josiah probably.
Yeah, so I have one written down here for you. It says, be careful not to, quote, educate yourself out of a relationship with God. I think I had other ones that said, like, the logic is a tool of the devil or something like that. And it's like, holy crap. Yeah. Oh, man, it's funny, but it's really sad because a lot of Christians will take this perspective where they're afraid of the idea of a logical discussion, of logical debate, to have a conversation about stuff. And yeah, it's just, you can't be afraid of that kind of stuff. That logical discourse is how we learn, how we think, how we grow. And that's very cult-like of a church to say, hey, you can't use logic. Well, okay, then how are you supposed to? I don't know, man. What do you think about all of that?
Oh, I definitely think the church doesn't use logic. I also sent you a few things about like a debate between like an evolutionist and a creationist, and the creationist just kept saying like, okay, well, prove evolution. Give me proof the Big Bang, it was like, give me proof that the Big Bang happened. It's like, okay, what do you accept as proof? And the creationist just kept flinging off, just like kept pestering him, just like, give me proof, and then never would say anything. And then as soon as he said something that kind of like contradicted his own argument, and then he just like left. So I think logic definitely needs to be preached in church, because otherwise you'll have those kind of debates where the creationist will go against the more logic driven field and kind of contradict himself out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of people. I would take the statement you made about the church not using logic, and I would quantify it. There are certainly churches out there that do, but there's also a lot of churches that don't. And it's very concerning to see churches that don't. You need to be able to have, Paul even talks about this. He says, always have, it might have been Paul or Peter, actually. I can't remember which. There's a verse in the New Testament that says, always have an answer for the hope that you have. Always have an explanation and a reason for what you believe and why you believe it. And that's really important to have as a Christian. Because if you don't have that, the Bible talks about going out and winning over new believers and everything. If you don't have a reason for why you believe what you believe, and you can't logically articulate it in a fair way, how else are you supposed to convince anyone that, hey, Christianity is worth giving a shot?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that one was really funny. As soon as you sent me that, I'm like, oh, we got to talk about this one on the podcast, because holy crap, that is scary to me. That's really scary. Next follow-up was, we were talking about your rainbow theory last week and how you said that you think that the second judgment isn't going to be as harsh. And we kind of talked about this a little bit before we went live here, so I'm going to kind of address it and then you can clarify stuff and everything. Okay. So my initial inference on that was you were saying God wasn't going to judge everyone again, but you clarified that and you said that you believe he is, which is correct. That's in the Bible. but that it's not going to be as harsh of a judgment. And I would, from where you're coming from, I think I would actually agree with that, where it circles back to what I said last week about how God's only going to hold you accountable for what you know. So if you haven't had a chance to believe fully and you haven't had a chance like to have everything laid out, you're only going to be accountable for what you were given to learn. So in that sense, yes, there's certainly going to be leniency, but there is also going to be a lot of harsh judgment. And I think too that going to the deconstruction discussion, since this is a Genesis 1 deconstruction episode, there is going to be very harsh judgment for those Christians out there that hurt believers and made them deconstruct to the point where they weren't logically consistent and walked away from the faith. To simplify that statement there's going to be a harsh judgment for those in authority in the church that pushed away believers out of the church by their behavior and actions. Now, that can certainly be forgiven. There can certainly be repentance for that kind of stuff. But there is going to be a harsh reaction from God about that. So I would say there's certainly going to be a judgment, and it's going to be on a wide scale. There might be some people that are like, hey, you know what? You were in a remote tribe in the Amazon and you tried to seek me as best as you could. You're going to go to heaven. Versus like the flip side of that is like, you know what? You were the leader of a mega church and you push people away from me, God, speaking as God here, you push people away from me and you profess to know me and you use your position of power for abuse and for your own gain. That's the kind of people I think that God is going to say, you did all these things in my name, but get away from me. I never knew you. Because that's a verse in the Bible as well where Jesus is talking. And he says that there's going to be people that claim, Lord, we did all these things for you. And God's just going to say, I never knew you. Get away from me.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to call out specific churches or whatever.
No, absolutely. We're not going to. No, don't call out specific churches. I'm sure we both could come up with examples off the top of our head.
I don't know the name of it, but I do. I'm going to kind of stay a little vague here, but I do know of a church that like kind of boasted about buying a private plane. So like that's kind of that's not very advocating for the church.
Yeah, and it kind of depends on the situation and everything too, where if that's just for the mega church pastor to be able to fly around the country and all of that, it's like probably a little more on the questionable side for church funds to do something like that, versus it's like, okay, if you bought a plane so that you can send Bibles and water and food to like kids in Africa or something that need that, okay, you know what, I can get on board with that. That's pretty cool. So a lot of it I feel like kind of depends on the intent and what your use for it is as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could totally understand if you like buy a plane or like specifically for a missionary kind of purpose, but I think this was just purely personal and so that he could fly around.
Yeah, and that's concerning. So next thing here, give me a second to get this popped up, but he's not quite a listener because he commented on a clip I posted on TikTok, but I'm going to count him as a listener because he listened to the 25-second clip that I posted from last week's episode. So I'm going to play the clip here, and I'm going to try to run it through the mic as best I can, so it might come through a little grainy. I'll apologize in advance for that. And then I'm going to read his comment, and then we're going to discuss it. Sound good?
Oh, yeah.
Are only accountable for really what they know and what they're able to know. Like, if you live in a remote tribe in the Amazon and you've never heard the name of Jesus, you're not going to be expected to confess that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart he was raised from the dead, or you'll be condemned to hell kind of a thing. Like, God's not going to expect that of you because that's not fair. So, did that come through all right for you, Trace?
Yeah, it was a little quiet, but I think it'll do fine.
All right, cool. I had it primarily on the podcast mic and not so much on your mic. So... Got a comment from Jake K here. Says, so stop forcing it on everyone and then we'd all go to heaven. So I responded with like, hey, there's more context to this. Go watch the show. But I'm actually going to specifically address that here because, I thought about this at first. And at first I was like, maybe there's a logical fallacy here. I don't think this is so much a logical fallacy as it is just maybe a misunderstanding of the Christian argument. So this very much warrants a fair response. This is a fair thought. Me saying that doesn't mean that everyone in the Amazon is going to go to heaven. You're going to be accountable for the effort that you put in. So if you have someone in the Amazon's never heard the name of Jesus and they go out and they're like a mass murderer Oh, but they didn't hear the name of Jesus, so it's okay. No. There's a certain degree of accountability and common human sense there to be like, hey, probably shouldn't be murdering people. Now, there is certain instances where that's like very much a cultural like norm in some of the more vicious tribes and everything. And so, again, it gets nuanced. But just because you haven't heard the name of Jesus doesn't mean, everyone automatically goes to heaven. No, that's not how it works either. It's based off of your individual effort and all of that. And then the other thing I want to address here is, again, he didn't listen to the first episode, I don't think, so I'm not going to fault him on this. So stop forcing it on everyone. We very much harped, you and I, Trace, we very much harped in the first episode of how we're not trying to force our beliefs on anyone. So that one seems borderline ad hominem to me, to make that assumption, because I'm not forcing my beliefs on anyone. Everything I've uploaded on social media is not forcing my beliefs on anyone. If you feel that way, I apologize. I'm having a logical discourse. And if you feel like just having a logical conversation is forcing my beliefs on you, you might need to do some internal, again, I mean this as respectfully as possible, but you might need to do some internal self-reflection if you perceive something like that as an attack.
Yeah, my kind of comment here is just like, if you want to go right to the assumption of, they're trying to force it on people, then it's just not for you. If you don't like it, then you don't have to listen.
No, you don't have to listen at all. We're trying to have a logical conversation, a logical discourse here. We're trying to logically speculate on life, and explore both theology and philosophy. These episodes are by nature, of course, going to be more theology heavy because we are studying the Bible. So we're about to, here in probably the next 5-10 minutes, dive really deep into Genesis 1, a lot deeper than you guys have ever probably heard Genesis 1 explored, unless you're like a pastor or something like that, or speak, ancient Hebrew or something. Because I did do an analysis of the original Hebrew text in an interlinear study, comparing the original ancient Hebrew and the English, and compared them. And we're about to dive into that topic here once we kind of wrap up with these follow-ups and listener communication things.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other things I'm going to touch on, unless you have something else you want to add on that follow-up, Trace.
I mean, the only thing is that, like, we're going to be theological and philosophical, but, half the other point of the show is mythological, too. So it's not like we're going to be purely talking about Bible stuff. It's just that's what we want our standing ground to be. So we're setting up in that ground at the moment. But we will eventually branch out.
Yes, and absolutely. We're setting the groundwork here. And we talked about this in the first episode. It's like, even if you're not a Christian, even if you think the Bible's entirely made up, hearing a discussion on the Bible like this is going to be important and crucial for you if you're doing a comparative myth study. Because even if the Bible is like made up, it still would quantify, from your perspective, it would still fall under the category of myth. And it still warrants study. It still warrants that exploration to be able to dive in and understand it and see what it really means. So... yeah, I totally lost my train of thought there. So unless you have something else you want to add, let's shift gears here. I am going to say, that actually flows into my next point perfectly. I want to explain a little bit more about why myth is worth studying, in my opinion. Because there are a lot of things that get thrown into the myth category that turn out to be true. Perfect example of this is the Iliad. It's the story of Troy. Troy, as of I think like 50, 80 years ago, maybe even more recently, was thought to actually be a myth. The whole Iliad was actually thought to be myth. Like historians, archaeologists, they did not believe that Troy actually existed as a city. They thought it was a fabrication. But someone read the text, did association with the terrain and the descriptions of everything from what the Iliad was saying to where it should have been in like Turkey or whatever. I think it's in Turkey. And they pinpointed the location, and someone ended up going out and doing a dig there. Come to find out, Troy actually exists. And now we no longer consider the Iliad to be just myth in terms of like Troy and the location and the Battle of Troy. Now there is, I've only read a little bit of it a while back. From my recollection, there's still a lot of references and stuff of like the demigods and everything that you have in Greek myth playing into it. So then... we can accept that Troy existed, but then how much do we accept the claims about Achilles and Hercules and all these others? I forget who all was in the Iliad, and we'll probably do a study on the Iliad at some point. But what do we do?
Yeah, there's also
Go ahead.
There's also that branches off of the Iliad is the Odyssey too. 'Cause
Yeah.
that's right after the Trojan War. But yeah, there's all kinds of stuff that we could get into. I, yeah, I don't want to get too into it, but there is like gods meddling in with the Trojan War, and it's like the Trojan War is like a direct result of the gods taking action. So we'll get into that at a certain point.
Yeah, and then you have to speculate, okay, if Troy is real and Troy was believed to be a myth, how much else of this is myth? Is everything else myth? Is the account of it, just glorified to fit the terms of the, the lowercase g gods that the Greeks believed in? Or is it an actual real historical account of beings that used to exist, and like giants or something that used to exist? But yeah, we'll get into all of that in our Greek mythology study. That's coming at some point. One last thing I'm going to say too is, before we kick off this Genesis 1, I will apologize again because I don't know what I got, but it's some nasty respiratory infection I'm just getting over here. So if you hear me kind of coughing or my voice sounds a little bit weird, I apologize. I still very much do have a voice for radio. So you didn't laugh at that one, Trace. All right, never mind. Trying to be funny.
Okay. It was just, I tried to keep it down.
I have a face for radio and the voice of a mime. But anyway, let's flow into Genesis 1 here. I'll apologize again for any coughing or clearing of throats that you hear. I'm going to try to keep it to a minimum and mute if I absolutely have to. But, again, we're going to try to do this with minimal edits. So, yeah, we'll kick into it here. So, Genesis 1. Let's start with our deconstruction here, Trace. Are you ready?
As ready as I'll ever be.
There you go. Also, too, you've told me that you had some questions and everything you wanted to ask. And initially, I'm the kind of person where I like to be prepared for questions and stuff like that. But I want this to be an authentic and honest podcast. And if I don't, I want to just to take it on the fly, because I feel like that's fair, just to take it on the chin, to do the best I can to come up with an answer, to be able to be honest if I don't know the answer and say, you know what, I don't know. And then maybe come back in a future episode and address that. I don't know, but I'm going to try to find out the answer. That's always the response that you want to have. So let's take a look here. We're going to go a little bit heavy at first into kind of word by word. I'm going to be reading a lot of the actual account of Genesis here. In the beginning here, we're going to be focusing on a lot of word by word analysis, and then we're going to kind of shy away from that as we continue along in the text. So that's just kind of a warning for you all. This may be very interesting. This may be a little bit dry. I have no clue what direction it'll go. Another thing I want to clarify is that we're not talking about evolution or other perspectives here on creation. We're just looking at what Genesis 1 is saying and what we can infer and believe off of what Genesis 1 says. So I need to stop saying it's such a bad filler word. But yeah, we're just trying to see, how can Genesis 1 be interpreted? Because a lot of people like to try to take evolution and creation and fit them together into theistic evolution and all of that. So we're trying to examine Genesis 1 here and say, okay, is that what Genesis 1 is saying? What is Genesis 1 saying? What can we believe? What does the Bible actually say at its core? So we're going to kick off here, and we're going to read Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. That threw me for a loop because I think I have the NIV memorized and I'm using NASB right now. So that was definitely a little bit different verbiage, but it's good. All right, so let's talk about verses 1 and 2 here. So an interesting thing, I'm going to touch on this a little bit later on as well in the episode, but the word for heavens in Genesis 1 is shamayim, which, if you think about that one for a minute, you go over to the Eastern philosophy and everything. What are spiritual scholars, I guess? What are spiritual scholars called in like the Far East, Trace? Are you aware?
No.
They're called shamans. So it's an interesting textual analysis here. And this word for heavens here is actually used throughout the Bible to annotate heavens. I recognize it from studying things like Ezekiel and everything as well in Interlinear. So Shamayim sounds like shaman. So it's just it's a cool cross-cultural textual analysis of a specific word. Now, how far that goes back, I don't know that whether that would go back to the Genesis account of the Tower of Babel, whether that would go back to King David's time and cross-cultural transference and stuff there, I have no clue. But it was definitely a really cool word, and it was definitely worth mentioning there. Next thing I'm going to touch on is, it says, and the earth was formless and desolate emptiness. We're reading from Genesis 1:2 now. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Now, this is something that's missed by a lot of people, I think, when they're first examining the text. This word for waters is hamayim, which is, it's like a conjugation of the word mayim. It does indeed mean water. So hamayim specifically, adding the H, the ha, would make it the. So it would be hamayim, the waters, or the water. I didn't specify that one in my notes, so I'll apologize in advance there. So this is something really interesting we have right off of the bat, where we are told in Genesis 1:2 that God did not create everything, but that water actually existed before God started creating anything. So that's something that's often missed by a lot of people when they're looking at this. So you might have noticed a similarity here to hamayim and shamayim, the two words that we've done an analysis on thus far. So there's speculation as to whether or not these two words are actually connected. Generally, I think it's mostly accepted by Hebrew scholars that they're not, but that shamayim is a derivative of the word shama, and hamayim is from the word mayim. So the fact that these two words sound similar doesn't mean that they were derived from each other, but it is still an interesting thought to consider that there are similarities in these words and that they are both describing water and sky, two expanses of volumes with a liquid from a physics perspective, because air would be a liquid in terms of like talking, physics and thermodynamics and all of that. Anything you want to add, Trace? Because I've been rambling a while there. I'll give you the floor for a minute.
I do think one of the things I wanted to touch on in my questions, but it's more of just a general note, but there's a lot of talk about the water, which I think is interesting in itself, because verse 2, it's I'm reading from ESV. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. So I just think it's interesting that it's talking about kind of okay, so he's just kind of looking over the ocean, and I just find it interesting. And there's a lot more talk about just water. There's stuff in which you haven't gotten there, but verse 6 and stuff. But I just find that intriguing.
Leave it to the fish nerd to get excited about water.
You got me.
But yeah, no, that you are absolutely right. There is a lot of talk about water, and it's interesting too to look at and consider how much water is necessary for life. And I mean, that's something that we look for when we're looking at other planets and everything as well, to try to see if they're hospitable and habitable or not. Is there water there? Could there be other life there? Because life needs water. It's something, just an interesting note. I'm not saying it necessarily means anything explicit. It's just, again, logically speculate.
Yeah, I never even thought about that. Just water is one of the kind of standards we look for in life. And here it is in the first 2 verses that it talks about him looking over the face of the deep.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because it's, the word for void is void. It does mean emptiness, nothingness. And the face of the deep can also mean nothingness, but it specifies waters, and it does use the word for waters. Now, there is an understanding as well that the Hebrews would sometimes look at the great abyss of the waters and, say it's, an abyss, or they would even consider it a form of hell, I think. I could be wrong on that. But I don't really think that that's what we see here, because then we go down a couple verses and we'll see God shaping and forming this water.
Mm-hmm.
So Anything else there? You want me to kick off to verse 3?
No, you can keep going then.
Okay. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So there's a lot to unpack here, because the first thing we're going to touch on, and I'll touch on this more when we get to day 4 of creation. The word here is hour. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this one. It's like, it has like an OWR sound, hour kind of sound. It's the literal translation is light. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit when we get to Genesis. I don't know the verse. When we get to day 4 of creation, this is contrasted to a different word, which means luminaries. So light is created on day 1. Luminaries, celestial bodies that produce light, are created on day 4. So we are being told here by this text, light is created immediately. It's the first thing. And I would also speculate as well that maybe this is telling us, again, I could be totally wrong on this. A way to interpret this would be that this is when angels and demons are created, and that this is when there is like the falling away of like the rebellion in heaven, if you will, that leads to Satan and everything. A lot of Christians would be familiar with that kind of perspective. Where this is that God's creating, good like beings and bad beings, if you will, and then separating them. Because you look at this here and it says, and God saw that the light was good. It never says that he saw the darkness as good. It says God separated the light from the darkness. So you have to ask this question here when we're looking at Genesis 1:4. Separating the light and dark, is he talking about just physically separating light? Is he talking about spiritual separation of separating the light and the dark, the good and the evil? This is a good question to ask, and I don't have the answer to this. This is something I'm speculating on here. I would lean slightly more to being physical, but something I should have done is I should have gone and I should have studied angel appearances and everything in the Bible and seen if this word for light is used in those instances. That's something I'll have to do in maybe a future episode. Maybe we'll do an episode or 2 or a series on angels. Maybe I'll save it for that. What do you think about that?
I think we should definitely. I was just about to say that we should definitely get into just the episode only on angel appearances and.
Yeah, and that's going to be pretty lengthy.
Like
That'll be a series for sure, because there's sprinkled accounts throughout all the historic narratives. There's Ezekiel, there's Daniel, there's Revelation, and I think that there's a couple more in there I might be forgetting. Another let's see. No, I'll skip that. Genesis 1:5. I think it's important to note here that he is using... It sounds like he's using light to mark time. He is using light to mark time, yes. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And this is why I would kind of err maybe a little bit more on the physical side, but it is kind of hard to distinguish for sure what maybe the original intent was and what's specifically being created here, if it's just light or if it's spiritual stuff as well. Because we don't know, maybe that there's some kind of overlap in the physical presence of light and the spiritual world. Maybe like the way that light functions to some degree overlaps with the fourth dimension. I don't know. This is just me logically speculating, throwing stuff out there.
Well, would it be possible that maybe, is there like a Hebrew word for day and night? Could that maybe kind of have a double meaning for other stuff too?
The words for day and night, let me pull up the Interlinear Hebrew here real quick while we're on air. Just give me 1 second, because I'll recognize it.
Because my thinking is, like, a lot of cultures, well, I can't really say for sure, but, like, some culture might have a word for something, but it actually is kind of a double entendre for something else entirely as well. But the way we interpret it is like, oh, it means this singular thing, but in reality it could mean two.
Yeah, certainly. So the word for day here is the same word that's always used for day. It's yom, and we're going to talk about that one in a minute here when we're wrapping up our analysis of Genesis 1:5. The word for night is lila, which is consistent with, that's currently, like in modern Hebrew, that's even used. If you want to wish someone good night, you say Laila Tov. It means night good, good night. And then Yep, the words for evening and morning are the same as is used in modern current Hebrew. Erev Tov Erev Tov is like good evening. When it says evening here in Genesis 1:5, it's Erev or Ereb. The BV sound is interchangeable in the Hebrew language. It's the same character. And then boker is for morning, which is also the word for morning in Hebrew, like now, like today's Hebrew. Like if you were to go over and say the word boker in Israel right now, it would mean morning to them the same way it means morning in this Genesis 1:5 text. So in terms of on the surface to your question, Trace, no, but there could certainly be a deeper meaning here where these words could mean something spiritual as well. But the way that they are presented here, it definitely seems like they are very referring to something very physical. And let's flow down a little bit further, because I think it's going to answer your question as well. So a lot of people speculate about when it's talking about days, and they think that, they could mean, Second Peter or something says, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. And they somehow think that something in Aramaic / Greek from several thousands of years after this can be used to translate this specific verse, like from across a different language. You can't do that. And the argument there is that, this could mean like, a day with the Lord is as 1,000 years. So when it says that it's a day here, that means it could be 1,000 years. Well, if you're trying to make evolution and creation merge, which is what most people are trying to do, that just doesn't fit here. It doesn't work, because 6,000 extra years doesn't get you enough time for the evolutionary timescale that would exist. And if you're just trying to fit that in to like make sense of the text as a whole, you also have to factor in that living beings aren't actually even created until I think day 5. Yes, day 5 is when fish and birds are created. So let's look at what the original Hebrew is here. So you have Erev referring to evening, and then it says boker, which means morning, and then it says day, yom, and then it says echad, the first. So basically what's being said here is, and I skipped like one grammatical filler, it's wehi. So Erev, wehi, boker, yom, echad. It would be how this would read. And that means evening, and there was morning, day, the first. From context of Hebrew, and this is widely understood amongst most Hebrew scholars, if you have any of one of 3 things present, the word yom always refers to a 24-hour day. If you have a reference to an evening, a morning, or a number of a day, any one of those 3, anywhere else in the whole Old Testament, it is always understood that word yom is referring to a 24-hour day period. So we actually have all 3 right here. So this is, from a scholastic perspective, from a Hebrew scholastic perspective, this is indisputable that this flow of 5 words here, Ereb, Wehim, Boker, Yom, Echad, is referring to one literal 24-hour period. I'm going to make a note here as well that the Hebrews understood that a day would begin on the evening. So whenever like the Sabbath would begin and they would have their Sabbath rest, that would actually start at sunset. That was their way of marking time, not the 24-hour midnight and noon way that we mark it now so much. It was still the same flow. It was still like, 24 hours a day span, but it's saying there was Ereb, evening, so the sun went down, and there was morning, so there was the sun came back up. That made a day, and it was the first day. That is what is being said here. From the original Hebrew, from the context itself, there is no other way that you could translate this, at least that we've examined thus far. Anything you want to add, Trace?
I did notice that. And that was one of my questions at the end, is like there was evening and then there was morning. So it's just an interesting note that they have evening first in their day, and then it goes to morning.
Yes, exactly. 2 other things I'm going to clarify before we move on from Genesis 1:5. And I will not harp on the rest of the days as much as I'm harping on this one. It'll just kind of be like when we get to the other ones, I'll be like, yep, here it is again, kind of a thing. Ehad, I did learn a little bit of modern Hebrew a couple years back just because I was interested in the language. And ehad is actually still one in the original Hebrew language as well. So if you were to go say Ereb Wehim Boker Yom Echad to someone over in Israel, they would, I think, this is my understanding, all the words look the same to me from phrases I learned from modern Hebrew. So this would actually be, they would understand this. They would be saying, okay, yeah, we know exactly what you're saying. This is from Genesis 1. You're saying there was evening and there was morning on the first day. I think there was one more thing I was going to say, but it totally slipped my mind. So we are going to carry on here. Genesis.
Well, if you
ahead.
want, I do have a question referring to the first 4 verses. I kind of just it just kind of clicked in my head about it. If you want me to do that, or now or at the end.
Let's do it on the fly. You know what? Might as well. Tell you what. Ask the questions if it's appropriate for the flow and you think it'll spur on the conversation. If we don't specifically hit on that and you don't think it fits, just save it for the end and we'll tackle it there.
Okay. So I just want to make a note, and I know this was a little while ago you said this. On verse 4, and God saw that the light was good, and you said he doesn't comment that the darkness is good. Well, in verse 2, he says the darkness was already there. Darkness was over the face of the deep. So I'm thinking whenever he says that, and God saw that it was good, because he also mentions it a few times throughout this chapter, I think it's just saying that he's happy with what he made. That's the final. It's yeah, that's good. I'll move on to the next thing. So I think him not acknowledging darkness, I don't think that's necessarily saying darkness is bad, but I think it's just kind of darkness was already there, so it doesn't need to be acknowledged. But light, that's new. That gets acknowledged.
That's fair. Yeah, no, actually, I would agree with that 100%. That's a very profound thought. Well done. I love that. I totally missed that thought and that perspective. Is that, yeah, it's not just water that's actually there, but it's actually, darkness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Yeah, no, for sure. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would agree with that. So then I would go back and amend my perspective and say this is probably I would say this is definitely talking about a physical creation here. Now, could there also be a secondary meaning of how there's a spiritual creation here and the spiritual is being separated? Possibly, but it is at the very least talking about a physical creation. So I would amend that perspective here and clarify that. So I remember what else I was going to say while you were talking. How do we have an evening and a morning when the sun is not yet created? This is a good question. I'm going to, unless you want to speculate at it, I'm going to answer it for you, but I'll let you have a chance at it first if you want.
I don't got anything.
Okay. So, I'll say the question again here. How do we have an evening and a morning and a day referring to a 24-hour period when the sun is not yet created? That's because this is another creation that is taking place that we are being told about in Scripture. God is creating time here. He is not creating the ways that we would use to mark time, but he is creating time. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, that's a nice way to put it. It's kind of in the background of it, but yeah, I like it.
Yeah. And he doesn't necessarily say that it's good or bad, but it is something that's being inferred here. Because everyone is like, oh, well, the sun isn't created until day 4, so that doesn't logically add up. How do you have evening and morning? It's like, no, there would be something there'd be a way it would work. And I almost hate saying that because it's sort of a cop-out, but there's a way that it would work. It's more God's taking this and he's putting it in our way of how we would understand the passing of time, or how the Hebrews understood the passing of time. That's, because they wouldn't have understood if you told them, 24-hour day. Well, what does a 24-hour day mean? Because they didn't have the ways of marking time. This is putting in their terms, hey, there was a 24-hour period that was a day. Now, how specifically evening and morning would have been marked when light and darkness were intertwined when they were first created and then separated, that I can't tell you. But this, from reading the text, that's what this means here. Anything else you want to add, or I'm going to flow into the next section of creation? I
mean, I guess you could say maybe time, Well, no, because it kind of infers that time was created here, because it doesn't mention in the first couple verses, but the very first verse, the first three words are "in the beginning," already inferring that there's some kind of time there. You can't have a beginning without time.
Right. So are you just kind of affirming the point there, or are you disagreeing with it?
I don't know.
I think it's giving us a glimpse into past our three dimensions here. When it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, this is a summary. This is a preface of about, because obviously, well, we'll get into this next week. We're going to have a guest on that's going to be a pastor, and he's going to talk about the gap theory. And it's a theory that there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 here, that there is a passage of time that's not accounted for. So we'll get into that. But for now, let's take this.
Okay.
Let's take this literally to mean in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. My understanding of this statement, this is like a title to your chapter kind of a thing. And then it goes in to tell us how this happened. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. I would argue this is a glimpse into eternity that we are being given. We are being given a small glimpse into what God was doing before time began, outside of time, which again circles back to one of my constraints when I was talking about my faith struggles, about how you had to have a being outside of all of the dimensions of our physical world, of the universe, outside of our reality, outside of time, to jumpstart everything. And that is what this is referring to within the first two verses of Genesis.
Okay, so like that in the beginning, that's more so a phrase that can help us understand in our time-centered understanding of it.
Yeah, well, it's a preface. It's like hey, you know what? I'm going to go to the grocery store. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my keys, and then I'm going to go get in the car, and I'm going to make sure that my seat's adjusted, and then I'm going to turn the car on. You know, it's like I'm not doing it twice just because I said it as a preface, and then I'm describing the actions of how I'm doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how that's taken here. That's how I would take it. And again, we're going to get into this either next week or the week after's episode when my pastor friend comes on, because he's more of a proponent of the other theory that there's a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and we're going to talk about it more there and debate it, discuss it, the pros and cons of the belief and everything like that. But for now, let's just operate under that assumption that statement I've made. And we'll kind of go from there, and we'll circle back around to that when we have a subject matter expert from the other side as well. All right, well, let's carry on to Genesis 1:6. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day." Now, right off the bat, I'll say, well, actually, no, I won't say that right off the bat. We'll talk about the second day in a moment here. So here we see God shaping the waters. He's not creating again. He's forming. He's for lack of a better word, manipulating. He's playing with it like Play-Doh, if you will. He's putting it in its place. And that's an important distinction to be made in contrast to everything we've just talked about how indeed it's never said that God created water. He creates an expanse to separate the waters, but he's not creating water. The water is being shaped. It's being molded. So Genesis 1:8, God called the expanse heaven. So basically there are two different theories as to what's going on here. Again, I'll clarify, this is the Hebrew word shamayim for heaven. It's the same word that we're always, seeing for heaven throughout the Bible. There are two different theories as to what it means that God is separating waters below and waters above. The first theory is that, well, he's just putting the clouds and everything in the sky. And those are the waters above, and the waters below would be ocean. The other theory is that there would have been an initial canopy that's actually created, a canopy of water. And this is, I think this exists in a couple other myths and everything as well. So we might see this again. And this will be a fun comparative mythology study here as well when we're talking about creation accounts. There's a theory that the Earth was surrounded on its atmosphere with a bubble of water, like that there was a bubble of water on the exterior, and that then what's happening here is that there's a bubble of water on the exterior of the sphere, there's a space of sky when you pass through that layer, and then at the core layer is more water. That is what's understood as happening right here, at least according to one theory. So it's an interesting perspective as well when you look at the account of the flood, if you take that account as literal, that this canopy of water, this ocean worth of water that's sitting above the Earth as well, shatters and starts pouring down. And it's also interesting to think about because you know how prisms work and how refraction of light works and everything. How would it have looked if we had all this water in the sky and you had all of this light passing through? Rainbows would not have existed the way that they do now. So when you see rainbows appear after the flood, after this canopy has been destroyed, at least again from this perspective, it makes sense from a physics perspective, because that's why the rainbow suddenly just like shows up and God says, see that? That's a promise. If Noah had grown up his whole life seeing that, why would that have any significance? Versus like if that was something new and different, that would have a lot more significance to it. Again, we're logically speculating here. I'm not saying this is absolutely true. That's the side I would lean towards, but it's an interesting theory to play around with either way. What thoughts do you have?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, but I'm just wondering how that would work scientifically. I mean, I'm not like an atmosphere scientist at all, but like just imagining just a giant surface of water. Like I just can't picture how that could work.
Yeah,
At least from my understanding of things.
We need to find like a meteorologist. Well, I don't trust meteorologists. They get the weather report wrong. So fun fact, here's something interesting for you about weather. Did you know that when they say there's a 50% chance of rain, it doesn't actually mean a 50% chance of rain? It means that a 50% of the forecasted area is going to have rain.
I did know that, yeah. That's only like a recent thing I learned, but yeah.
Yeah, same. It's like this is the new trend where it's like, what the heck? I thought that it was always talking about like 50% chance of rain. So technically, I mean, honestly, it just sounds like a cop-out to me to make sure that they're never wrong. Because they're like, oh, well, if you didn't get rained on, the other 50% of the area we projected did. It's like, okay, all right, sure, whatever. Whatever, buddy. But, yeah, I don't know about the physics of that either. We'd have to find someone that would be a subject matter expert and have them on at some point. That'd be an interesting idea to explore. And then for you, Mr. Fish Nerd, that asks another question of if there was an expanse of water in the sky, would there have been fish in that water? I don't know. Again, we'll maybe I'll be completely disproven here when we read a couple, like 2 verses down and be like, oh, yep, Josiah's an idiot. But, you know, all of these questions are definitely worth asking. Skyfish, are they real?
I mean, there is the flying fish, so maybe.
You never know, I guess. All right, unless you have anything else, I'm going to talk about the second day meaning here. So there is a distinction that's worth making here. It's a very, very minor change, but we'll talk about this probably a little bit more at the end. It says, and there was evening and there was morning. A more literal translation is a second day, not the second day, at least from my cursory study of the original interlinear Hebrew. We'll confirm this on the fly. No mistakes or edits whatsoever.
Now, I will throw out an idea here. That what if, because in verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So what if waters is like just a term for the celestial body? Because, okay, in verse 6 then, he says, let there be an expanse. And let it separate the waters from the waters. So what if he is then separating these celestial bodies and then just like verse 8 called the expanse heaven? What if that could just be a general term for space? And so like our solar system and all the other planets, they were part of this body of water per se, but then they just got separated into separate entities.
In other words, you're saying the Big Bang happened when God said, "Let there be light."
I mean, no, because it's a very clear distinction of the first day there was light, and the second day he then separated the waters.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely a good thought. It's an interesting theory. I have, again, logically speculating. I don't have anything really for or against it per se. We are told in day 4, God creates the sun, the moon, and all of the stars, and I would infer that also includes all of the planets and everything, because we're not specifically told when all of the planetary bodies are formed. But
Yeah.
I would assume that they would be included with stars, because from our perspective on the ground, looking up at like Venus and Mars and everything, they do look like stars from Earth without a telescope.
Now, I do see I could reaffirm my point here with verses 9 and 10. Do you mind if I get into this?
Let me hear. Yeah, you know what? Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll circle back to talk about the second day.
Yeah. Okay, so, and God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called the seas. And God saw that it was good. So maybe all of this other water was kind of tossed to the side bench, and he just kind of like played around with this specific body of water, and then created the land and created Earth. What would you say to that?
It's definitely an interesting theory, that's for sure. Yeah, I don't know. Reading it the way that I read it is more that. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good. It's an interesting thought. Yeah, I don't necessarily have anything absolutely against it. I would think that it does sound more like that God is just doing his creation of Earth here, and then he's not really worried about anything else. And that's what we see going on, because it doesn't tell us that dry land appears on other planets, like Mars or anything like that. So I would say that that's more. Go ahead.
Maybe that could be the later stuff you said about how he creates the sun, the moon, and the stars.
Tell you what,
he separated the waters.
Let's put a pin in this and let's save this for day 4, because I feel like we're going to end up talking about day 4 otherwise. It's good thoughts. It's good thoughts. But yeah, let's circle back around to this here. So I'm going to touch on the second day before we carry on here. One distinction worth making is that, and this is my guess. This is from reading articles and stuff. It seems like that it's more being said a second day, not the second day. It is a small distinction. I would argue it doesn't really change the meaning here at all, because there's a difference between, if I tell you, hey, the first day I did this, on a second day I did this, on a third day I did this. That doesn't necessarily mean that the days are out of order or anything like that. But we'll talk about that more, I think, at the end, because I have some notes on that I want to discuss. So let's carry on here, unless you have any thoughts you want to add on that.
No, I'll save my thoughts till later.
Okay. And God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. Verse 10, God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. All right, so I'm going to do this one kind of quick so we can keep moving here. Waters are gathered into one place. This is telling us about the creation of Pangaea, the supercontinent. And then when he's saying that there were seas, as in plural, this is talking about, very minor bodies of water and stuff that exist. Like, for example, like the Red Sea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, things like that. But it distincts that God tells all of the water to be gathered into one place, and then that the dry land will appear. This is telling us about the supercontinent creation that we've been able to infer based off of, scientific geology. Anything you want to add?
That's a good point. I mean, we've had discussions about Pangaea in the past, but I never interpreted the verse 9, gathered in one place. Although, that could also kind of be talking about what I was saying, about how he separates the waters, and then he gathered the waters under the heavens. He just, got all of that water and kind of balled it up.
Well, that's what he's saying. The water under the heavens. He's automatically addressing that from the get-go. I can verify that here with Interlinear. Just give me a sec.
No, I mean, I think I understand what you're saying now. I think we're on the same page here. But he got the waters that were separated. He took half of those waters, formed it, and then put dry land in.
Yeah, he's not doing anything with the waters that are above the heavens, because here it says, the original Hebrew here is hamayim. So there's mayim, the word for water, and ha, meaning the. So hamayim, all one word, the waters. Mitahat, under. Hasamayim. Sorry, I'm not very good at Hebrew pronunciation sometimes. But it's ha shamayim. So it's the ha means the, and shamayim referring to the heavens. So the water under the heavens is specifically what's being addressed. And God said, let be gathered together, the waters under the heavens. So that it's not referring to the stuff above in this verse at all.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Still interesting thoughts. Keep them coming. Logically speculating. Disproving all theories on the fly. Just kidding. All right, so Genesis 11 to 13. Again, I'm going to breeze through this a little bit quicker now that we're kind of getting out of the... I like to focus on the semantics of what's being said. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay. I like to focus on the semantics of what's being said in the beginning because it is so abstract. And I believe that the word choice is very specific here. And even if you're not coming from a Christian perspective, I think that there's still merit in exploring what's actually being said here. But as we expand more and more into just the broad creation, it kind of explains itself through the translation. So I don't have to focus as much on the interlinear. Geez. Okay. Verse 11, and God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees, each bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Any thoughts?
It's a bit wordy.
It definitely is. And I think it's interesting, too, that this is also just looking at the text on a surface level here at face value. Plants are being created before light's created. Like, not light, excuse me, before the sun is created, before luminaries are created.
I mean, could it be said because in a few different places it says God is the light, so is he just that body of light?
So let's actually talk about that one for a minute, because that comes from John 1. There might be other verses talking about it, but I actually read that in contrast to this. I did not make notes on it. Greek is not so much my favorite area of study. I prefer to look at the Hebrew. I just like looking at the Hebrew more for some reason. But the actual chapter of 1 says that God is, like, I think it's referring to Jesus, but he is like the light. That's the inference there, if you look at the whole context of the chapter. So I don't think it's saying so much, and maybe I'm forgetting a verse or something, but I don't think there's specifically a verse that says God is light. It's an analogy, if that makes sense. God is the light unto men. So it's not saying that God created himself here. Again, I might be forgetting a verse. Maybe I'll have to go back and readdress this at a future point. But we are being told about the creation of light, and future verses in the Bible are referring to an analogy. I also think it's interesting to note here that it's very wordy, but it specifies that they are producing within their kind. It's not that you're not seeing anything about, that a apple leads to grapevines or ivy grows into a tree. It's that they're each producing seed, each according to its kind. And I think that's an interesting distinction here in contrast to like theistic evolution and everything, which we'll get into in future episodes. That there doesn't seem to be that kind of inference when you look at the biblical text and what's being said here, just from a pure semantics perspective.
Yeah, it's not really talking about like breeding, like how we got lemons. It's a mix between like two different kinds of citrus or whatever.
Well, yeah, but they're all still citrus. They're all
dog breeds.
They're all still the kind of citrus and everything. Like they're all still that broad kind. But it's not saying, that you could go from a clover and end up with like a redwood, like, pine tree kind of a thing.
Oh, okay.
That's what I'm talking about. There's specific.
More so talking about okay.
I would say that this verse is talking about specific bounds that are set on creation genetically that the offspring cannot cross. We will talk about that in a future episode. We are actually going to talk about some of the holes in the standard model of evolution, and we will address that when we get there. Let's see here. So let's kick off into 14. So we're on day 4 now. This is day 4's creation. And God said that there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. I'm going to note here before we talk about anything, the word for light here is different, I think, in most of its usage. It's merot, which refers to luminary. It's not the same word hour referring to light. This is specifically talking about a luminant body that emits light, not light itself. And it's an important distinction to make when you're talking about this here, because in the English version, we're only talking, the only word that's used here is light. But it's 2 different words. Anything you want to add to all of that?
I wouldn't say so. I do think it's interesting to note in 14 that it says, and let them be for signs and for seasons. So for seasons, it does make sense, but I'm wondering what the signs might mean.
Star of Bethlehem.
The what?
Star of Bethlehem. So when Jesus was born, there was a star that the wise men followed when they were studying the stars, and it led them to Jesus.
Oh.
So you
Gotcha,
have
okay.
this interesting thing of studying the stars, and you're able to kind of predict to a degree. Now, how much of that bleeds into like astrology kind of stuff versus like, hey, just looking and being aware of what's going on? Yeah, I don't know. I think we'll get into that in a future episode, I think, too, when we talk about like more of like occult and everything.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, that could that be like like the, gosh, I can't even remember the astrology signs and stuff. I'm Pisces. There's the Cancer, Virgo, that stuff. So is this possibly reaffirming that, or
from a hip
I mean,
response, from a hip
like
class,
you said,
from a classic, response as a Christian, I'm going to shoot off the hip and say no, I don't believe so. I don't have a reason, really, a logical reason to say that at this point. So we'll put a pin in this. I'm going to have someone that's a subject matter expert on the occult come onto the show in a couple months. Let's put a pin in this. I need to write. How about you write this question down for me? And we will bring this back up when we get him on, and we'll ask his take on it. And I think he can kind of explain this a little bit more. But I would say no, that I don't think that that's what this is inferring here.
I mean, it's just a speculation.
It's a good speculation. It's a good, fair question to ask. Okay, one thing I want to touch on too that's interesting is Genesis 1:16 when it talks about the stars. The word hakaukabim. Yeah, I don't know. It's similar to the words for like rolling or burning, and I would suggest as well. It's like a weird usage word where I think it comes from like maybe another language or something, but it potentially indicates knowledge of like the movements of the stars and the spherical shape, talking about rolling or burning and choosing a word like that to depict and describe the stars. I don't know. That was just kind of an interesting note for me right there, was to say, hey, it seems like they have, a moderate amount of celestial knowledge about how the stars and everything work. And you see this also actually overlap a ton when you study ancient structures and everything, and how there's a lot of astronomical alignments to these massive structures and everything. Like the pyramids, I don't know if you knew this or not, but they are actually aligned to the 3 stars of Orion's belt, and the scale of luminosity from the stars is actually scaled to the size of the pyramids.
Yeah, there's a lot of astrology. I can't think of the word right now, but there's just a lot of astrology in ancient cultures, and they do have a very big, wide understanding of stars. And there's plenty of reasons, but like a big one is for like mapping and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. They definitely seem to be very interested in a lot of movements of the stars and everything like that. If you study Serpent Mound's another one that I believe that Serpent Mound is astronomically aligned to the sunrise on the sunset, on the summer solstice, if you factor in progression of a certain number of years. So progression is the gradual shifting of the Earth, like how the North Star is not going to be the North Star in like several thousand years or something because of just the shifting of celestial bodies and everything like that. So you have all sorts of, and that's another reason why I want to visit like Serpent Mound and everything as well, is to, to see this. I was trying to do it on the summer solstice, but that did not quite work. But it's definitely, it's interesting to note all of this, and it does seem like this choice of word referring to a sphere or like burning or rolling is a very interesting choice for stars. I just think it infers a little bit more knowledge about celestial bodies than we sometimes give the ancients credit for.
Mm-hmm.
Unless you have anything else, I'm going to continue on.
Continue on.
All right. Verse 20, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Your things, Trace, right there, all your fishy friends.
Heck yeah.
And let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw it was good. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. So there's fish, and that would also include pterosaurs. Pterodactyls would have been created on day 5. And anything you want to add?
I don't know, because a pterosaur isn't a bird. It's also not a dinosaur. I want to get that clear. Yep. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs.
They are not.
But it just specifically says winged bird. So I don't know. Does that also include stuff like the penguin and the ostrich? Because they're technically birds. Or it's just saying that he created the creatures that have dominion over the seas and the sky.
Let's take a look at this actually in Interlinear Hebrew, because we have that capacity. Looking at, let's look at bird.
I do think it's interesting though that it does specifically mark the creation of sea creatures and birds, and for every other creature, it's just like, yeah, they're just kind of there.
Yeah, it definitely is interesting. So it's a specific derivative of the word for bird. I don't know enough about Hebrew to actually be able to intelligently comment on this, but it's like out, I think, is the word that's used here, and it's a derivative or a conjugation of oaf from Hebrew, oph. Yeah, oaf. The derivative of the word specifically refers to flying creatures for bird. It would specifically refer to flying creatures, at least in its original. I don't know if the conjugation would change anything necessarily here. This word is translated as fowl in the King James Version. But then again, it's King James, so that's just kind of King James doing its thing. Looking how it's used across other verses in the Bible. It's a good question. I would say that this is the most likely point that pterosaurs would have been created, because they are flying creatures, and that I think is what is. Oh wait, no, hang on. Yeah, in Genesis 1:20, the word for flying creatures, OPH sound. Yeah, that's what's used in 20. So it's specifically referring to flying creatures. So when it says, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens, that's actually flying creatures. That's what that word actually means, according to Strong's Interlinear I'm looking at right here. So then everything else in addition to that is just a conjugation of it.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. So it's just saying that there's now creatures in the sea and the sky.
Pretty much, yes. That's what's being said here. Our version is still lacking, as you see. And this is why I say I believe that the original of the Bible is inerrant. I do not believe that translations are inerrant. I think that there are errors in translation, not necessarily for fault of the translators, but I think that there's just stuff that's missing when you try to translate one language into another.
Yeah, because there's always words that we either don't have a word for them, or there's one word that has multiple different meanings, and we have multiple different words that can be translated from that word, and so we have to just kind of pick one.
Right, exactly. So, unless you have anything else, I'm going to carry on here.
No, carry on, my wayward son.
I'm just going to do the rest of Genesis 1 in one swing here, and then I'll hit a couple key points, and then I'll let you interject for thoughts, because I do want to shift gears and talk about one other thing. We're at like an hour 15. Do you just want to make this all one long episode? Because I feel like we probably got another 20-ish minutes of content. I don't know if that's enough to warrant splitting for a second.
I don't know, because I feel like we definitely could make...
There's not much else to talk about in terms of Genesis 1 creation, and then and then just talk about the poetry aspect a little bit, and then pretty much finish up from there. So I think we could take this one crack. So let's give it a shot. I will try to keep the pace going a little bit quicker, though, at least in terms of the rest of the text. So, and God said, verse 24, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, and everything that has breath of life, I have given you every green plant for food." And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. A couple things I'm going to hit here. Man's created on Genesis 1:26 on day 6 here. The Hebrew word for man is actually Adam. So when you have the word for man or mankind, that is Adam. That's what's being used here. Now, some people might take that to the extreme of whether or not Adam is metaphorical. I'll say let's talk about that in a second. Genesis 2, Genesis 3, deconstruction, as to whether or not that means Adam is metaphorical. Also note that our image is used here, annotating the Trinity, that God is referring to himself in the, I guess, third person. Yeah, maybe. English grammatical stuff is not necessarily my strong suit. Another interesting thing I'll note is that the beasts and livestock, it's a derivative of behemoth that's used here, and it's where we get our word behemoth. As they use a similar conjugation in Job 40:15-24 to describe the behemoth that I think is referring to a brachiosaurus. That's definitely something we need to hit on a future episode. Could you write that one down for me, Trace?
Wait, say that again so I can get it.
Let's hit on behemoth in Job 40:15-24. Maybe do that in the next episode.
Job
40:15-24. Sorry, I'm talking fast. I know.
40:15-24. Okay.
We'll talk about that one on the next episode, because this is already going long. I don't want to turn this into too much of a tangential exploration. Genesis 1:28, man is given dominion to rule and steward. We talked about that in the first episode, about how we both believe it's our job to take care of the earth. That's reflected in the Bible right here.
I do want to say I'm not sure I'm a big fan of the message of 28 saying to subdue it. Um, that kind of gives a very aggressive, like, take control over it.
Might be a
I don't know if
mistranslation. Let's
you
find out.
maybe, but in my reading of it, it just kind of gave me a weird. I mean, I'm sure I'm just reading it from my kind of biased perspective here, but it just seems a little aggressive over it.
But I mean, there is a degree to which we do that. I mean, when we, if we want to clear land and build farms, build houses, there is a degree of force in everything that's used in it. And that's kind of more of the way that I'm reading it right here.
I mean, that's true.
Yeah, it is. So to subject, subdue, force, keep under, bring into bondage, to bring under bondage and make subservient, to subdue, to force, even to violate, to subdue, dominate, tread down, to be subdued, to bring into bondage. These are all different meanings of this specific word and across other Hebrew usages and everything. I would say this isn't no way of, we could trash the earth. It's more like, hey, we are ruling God's creation. We are taking it and bringing it under control. I mean, when I have like a berry garden and everything, I'll walk in the berry garden and I will subdue it because the vines want to grow into places that they're not supposed to be. They'll try to grow onto the path with their thorns and everything, and I'll need to trim it back to make sure that it's maintained and well kept. That's an act of force to subdue it in a sense.
Okay.
So it depends on your interpretation. I think the subdue can definitely have negative connotations for people. I would agree with that. I don't think that that's necessarily what's being communicated here.
That's fair.
Last thing I'm going to hit on, again, we have evening and morning, day the sixth, or a sixth day. Follows the same template throughout, from beginning to end, where we see day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, and evening and morning is paired with each. Okay. Yeah, and it's not a sixth here, it's the sixth. I should have looked into this one a little bit more. It has the ha preface to it. So it is the sixth day here. It's worth annotating. So any final thoughts before we kind of shift gears here a little bit and finish up, Trace?
Yeah, so I do have a question. Verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. I'm kind of wondering what he means by our?
Were you spacing out when I addressed that one? Because I did say that already.
I guess so. I guess I did space out.
No,
yeah.
It's good. It happens. I mean, you got the hippie vibes going with your headband and everything. I know the listeners can't see that, but yeah, you very much got the long hair and the headband going. So you got to be a little spacey to be a hippie.
Yeah, for clarification, I'm wearing a headband with a bunch of mushrooms on it. So.
Oh boy. So our image here is referring to the Trinity. That is, yeah,
okay.
Because when you look at a very theological understanding of the creation of Scripture, you see all three components. You see, God Himself. You see the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, and then you have God's spoken word, which is understood to be Jesus, and that's expanded on a lot more in the New Testament. So you're seeing all three aspects of the Trinity playing a role into the creation here, and God is really specifying it when He's saying, to Himself, to the Trinity, hey, let's make man in our image. Let's make man after how we are. And so we have a bearance of this. So that is where R is coming from here.
Okay. And I also want to make a note. It's just a little fun observation here, and I feel like there's an explanation for it, but it does say in 29 and 30, it kind of gives an implication of we're only supposed to eat green plants.
You are absolutely right. This gets amended in Genesis 7 after the flood, when God says, behold, I've given you all things, and He says creatures that walk the earth and all sorts of other things that you can eat. So yes, until the flood, all humans were actually vegetarians.
Yeah, I just kind of thought that was a fun little note there.
Absolutely, good catch. I forgot to even mention that one. All right, so we're going to talk about a little bit of potential poetic meaning here, and I'm going to try to keep this quick, but there is some stuff that's worth discussing, and then we'll wrap up. So, and my voice is starting to kind of go a little bit. I don't know if you can hear it or not. I'm trying to keep it sounding good for our listeners, but I'll apologize if my voice kind of falters or you hear me coughing some, because yeah, this upper respiratory infection's killing me. All right, so Genesis 1. Some people have made the argument that it's poetic, it's poetry. Genesis 1 does not read like poetry we would find elsewhere in the Bible. There's a lot of parallel symbolism that's used across text that it lacks. Even if there was poetic language being used here, that wouldn't be a counter argument to the creation account being false, or that it's not referring to some literal account. It could still be, in other words, it could still be an actual creation account that's true narratively, but that reads a little bit more like poetry. So even if poetry was present in the original Hebrew here, that wouldn't discount Genesis 1 being a literal 6-day creation. But there are plenty of other accounts that we have. If you read the Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, there are all sorts of different analogies and parallel symbolisms that are used. We just do not see that used here in Genesis 1. Some examples of this, where David talks about, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. This is, a symbolism to, looking up to God, saving him. It's not so much that he literally necessarily saw God. Another one is that Song of Solomon talks a lot about, I guess this will be a small trigger warning for any small ears here. Not Song of Solomon, excuse me. Proverbs talks about the feet of a prostitute go down to hell. That does not literally mean that her feet are standing in hell. That means that, messing around with a prostitute is going to lead to, the destruction of your life, and it's going to lead to your life being a hell, and ultimately lead, to you going to hell especially if you're violating the marriage covenant, if you don't repent of that. And then all of Song of Solomon. Oh man, that book is that should very much have an R rating to it, in my opinion. We'll leave it at that. But read the Song of Solomon if you don't know what I'm talking about. It's the story of a husband and wife kind of wooing each other and saying explicit things in very paralleled language, in symbolic language. But again, we're not seeing any of this language being used here in Genesis 1. I also looked up a commentary from Gordon Wenham, and he studied Eastern creation stories. And he said that many Eastern creation stories do often flow as poetry or songs, but the Genesis 1 does not bear this resemblance. It doesn't have a hymn element. A lot of the Psalms and everything were meant to be sung. The Hebrews were really big on singing. It doesn't have any remnants of that here. But Genesis 1, according to Gordon Wenham, and this is from his book, it talks about Genesis 1 through 15. It says that it does not flow as typical narrative prose. So it doesn't flow as a typical narrative. And this is kind of more of a specific quote from the book. It's as if the importance of the story led to its approaching the definition of poetry. And I'd add to that, I'd say maybe its abstractness of thought also adds to it kind of seeming a little bit more like it's approaching how poetic language was used. But it isn't poetic. It doesn't fit any of the other poetic forms that we see. In fact, Vav, which is the 6th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, it looks like a little fishhook, like a reverse fishhook. It's a verb that's used significantly in narrative to specify narrative, and it is used 55 times within the creation account. And that source is Answers in Genesis, which I know some might be like, oh, Answers in Genesis, don't use them because you don't consider them to be real science since they speak out so much against the evolutionary theory. But for terms of doing actual textual analysis, it's definitely they're definitely subject matter experts in that area. Let's see what else. There's also the theory that Genesis 1 is a chiasm. So I actually had to look this one up because there was very little information about it. So chiasm trace refers to the mirroring parallels of a text. So where you have it's like they kind of mirror each other from beginning and end, and then they come together mirroring each other in the center, if that makes sense. You kind of understand what that means?
Yeah, I kind of get the gist of it.
Okay, so there's a theory that that's what's happening here in Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:1 through 3. So Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 2:3. that it flows like a chiasm. This is a theory that's proposed by some Christians. So you see this in things like light is created on day 1. Your luminaries, your celestial bodies are created on day 4. You have water that's formed on day 2. You have fish and everything that are kind of created on day 5. You do see vague parallels here. The first thing I would suggest is that doesn't defeat that this is and reads like a narrative text. Why wouldn't God follow a sequential order to bring order to chaos? Because if you read the beginning of Genesis, we are being given examples of the world in chaos, that there's darkness over the surface of the deep, Spirit of God is over the face of the waters, the earth is formless and void. God in his creation process is actually bringing systematic order to his creation by the way and the flow of his creation. So that would be my first argument against chiasm. Second argument is it wouldn't be exactly symmetrical thought if it was chiasm, because you have water existing before creation. Luminaries are placed in the expanse of sky that's created on day 2. There's all these gaps where it's not exactly symmetrical, where if you were making this a poetic, metaphorical text, those are symmetries that you would manipulate and make fit together. But it goes out of its way to specify that water is created. Well, water is not created. It is formed. It is shaped. Whereas all these other beasts that are in the water are created. So if this was a true chiasm, water would be created, and then the fish would be created, and this would be mirrored, and the text would have been changed to reflect this. So the fact that the text was not changed to reflect this is an indicator that this is in fact not chiasm. And then one other idea, I already touched on this a little bit. The idea is suggested that the days are not in order from the 2nd to the 5th day or the 6th day, and that it could mean a 2nd day for some of the days, or a 3rd day, or a 4th day. That doesn't necessarily mean that the days are out of order, though, because again, you could say a 2nd day, a 3rd day, a 4th day. You're still giving a number and an association to it, and the rest of it flows with the creation account. So that's not... Just because a is there instead of the in our translation and how you're translating it doesn't negate the order or the fact of it or mean that the days are out of order. And I don't even know what would be accomplished if the days are out of order, because you're still looking at 24-hour days and everything anyway, and this whole thing reads as narrative text. And then if you want to make this metaphorical or poetry, you're faced with a big challenge. Where do you draw the line? Because Genesis 1 flows into Genesis 2 and the rest of Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch, which for those that aren't as familiar with Christian books and everything, the Pentateuch is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books in the Old Testament. So you're faced with that problem then is, where do you draw the line on metaphor? Is it just Genesis 1 that's metaphor? Is it Genesis 2, 3, 4 that are metaphor? Is Cain and Abel metaphorical? Is the flood metaphorical? Is Moses metaphorical? Where do you delineate the difference? And when you're looking at the text, if this already reads like narrative, you want to say that this is metaphorical, you are then forced by your logical consistency to make huge chunks of scripture metaphorical, which if you want to approach it from a mythological perspective, again, that's fine, but I would just encourage you to be logically consistent. But you cannot be logically consistent from everything we've just talked about in this episode and say that Genesis 1 is poetry and metaphor and say that everything following the creation account is narrative, because it all flows the same. It all reads the same. We just did textual analysis on it. It is a literal account. One final thing I'm going to touch on as well for those that might still be questioning. Going to jump over to the next book in the Bible, Exodus. Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Exodus 31:17. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed. So here you have a second book that is stating and affirming that the creation account in Genesis 1 is accurate, and it is a literal 6-day creation. So even if you wanted to try to infer based off of the text that Genesis 1 and 2 or however far is poetic, there is still a massive counter argument to that, because these verses in Exodus exist to prove and validate that Genesis 1 is a literal 6-day creation, and it also affirms that God rested on the 7th day as well. So there is an inference that at least some of the days are in order just from those verses in Exodus I read alone. I don't have much else. I have been rambling for a while, so go ahead and jump in, Trace. Give me some snide comments or something.
Oh boy. All right. You kind of did touch on the Genesis 1 being a literal translation. Now, a kind of general question I also had is could some of it still be up for interpretation? Because like what you said at the like verses 3 to 4 about like the light that was created, it could also be meaning for angels and stuff. So do you think that some of it could still be up for like metaphors or yeah?
I think that everything that happened is a very literal, real, physical account of what was created. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't also be second meanings to some of these things that are created, specifically beyond our bounds of understanding when we're talking about the whole M-quad theory of looking into the fourth dimension to understand the spiritual. Because we're not really told what's created in the fourth dimension here. We're only given a glimpse outside of all dimensions of God existing outside of those dimensions in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. And then light is created. But what is inferred by light in the fourth dimension? I don't know. Could that be referring to a creation of angels and demons and the separation and the fall of certain beings in the spiritual? Absolutely. We aren't told this in Genesis 1. It is an inference. It's a guess. But I think that there's certainly room for looking to deeper meanings to things in Genesis 1. But I think I've laid out a very compelling, logical, text-based analysis and argument here about how Genesis 1, from how we interpret everything else in Genesis, from how we read narrative, with the presence of Vav being listed so much in the account, from how the account flows, from how specific the account is, from how wordy the account is in talking about, let all these creatures be created according to their kinds, and it was so, and God created these creatures according to their kinds. It's really obsessing over the fact of creation, of what's being created. There are clear bounds being delineated in what's being created here. So, yeah, I know I've kind of answered it once or twice already here, but the text itself, in terms of whether or not it's a literal 6-day creation, I do not think from everything I've laid out here, there's any room for discussion, debate, argument, interjection here. It's still welcome from our listeners, and I'll put the contact info out shortly if you disagree. But from everything that's been listed here, there's no room to reinterpret this as something else. If you want to add and interpret other things into it, such as creation of angels and stuff, I think that there's certainly room for that kind of speculation. I could also add in on day 6 that dinosaurs would have been created because it talks about the all beasts of the ground. And that's not specifically stated here in terms of like, oh, dinosaurs were created, but it does say, all beasts, that walk on the ground, everything that creeps. So anything that would have walked on land would have been created on day 6, including dinosaurs, which shouts in the face of the standard model of the evolutionary theory. And I'm definitely going to talk about some of the holes in the evolutionary theory. Not so much as a way of, I've absolutely disproved it, but there's a lot of questions about evolution in school that is just never addressed, and it's presented as absolute fact. And there's a lot of people out there that this happens on the Christian side too, but there's a lot of people on the evolutionary side that have been brainwashed into believing that evolution is flawless and there are no holes in it. I will tell you, when I got to a point when I was struggling in my faith and I took a step back from Christianity, I honestly looked at evolution for maybe a solid 2 seconds, and I saw all the holes and everything in it, and I'm like, this is not a viable, logical explanation for the way everything is in the universe. Like, even discarding Christianity, this is not a viable way to look at the universe. There are just too many holes. There are too many logical inconsistencies, and they need to be talked about more. They need to be addressed, and we will do that in a future episode. But yeah, that definitely, I definitely answered your question like 6 times. So I'm rambling. So I'm just gonna shut up and let you ask any other questions you have, because we are in the final question phase.
Yeah, no, I think we kind of covered it all up. I know I said I'd save my questions till the end, but a few of them were answered in in your discussion, or I would ask them in the moment. But yeah, no, I think we're pretty much done here.
All right, so you don't have any other questions? We got them all?
I think so.
Awesome. I love it. All right, I think you owe us a creature to talk about, because we're going to add in something else here. We're going to do fish talk for the intro, and we're going to do an interesting creature for our outro. Correct?
Yes.
Sweet.
Yes. So I figured, at first I thought like, oh well, the fish fact doesn't really fit. So what if I do like a mythical creature or like a beast or something as a little fact? But Josiah told me just do both. Why not? So I'm gonna do both. So I'm gonna try and keep them short here, because there will be future episodes where we go a little more in depth on creatures and myths, and sometimes the creatures and the myths kind of go hand in hand. But the little tidbit I have for today is the Kraken is actually Scandinavian in origin. I know stuff like I can't remember the movie, but it's a movie about the Greek gods and they summon the Kraken. So it's actually not a Greek story. It's not a pirate story in origin. It's Scandinavian, which, if you really think about it, Scandinavians were kind of ancient pirates.
They really were.
It all connects in the end.
It does. Yeah, actually, I might be incorrect in some of this history, but I'm just going to say it anyway. The Vandals, so vandalism, this is where we get our word for vandalism. The Vandals were actually, I think, an early form of Vikings that the Romans had to fight with and everything. So the Vikings have been seafaring people for a very long time. So it absolutely makes sense that they would have myths, of things like this. Whether or not they're real, that's a whole different discussion. But, whether they actually saw a Kraken or whether it was just, they thought they saw a Kraken. But that fits as to how they were the ones that kind of originate that idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other discussion. Like you said, I could go very much into a lot of sea creatures or sea monsters and kind of where their origin starts from, and explanations for them, other examples of misidentification. But that's for a future episode.
That's when we get to Norse mythology, right?
Yeah. I think that's where we'll start to really touch into it.
Heck yeah. I'll need to see if I can find someone that's like a Norse pagan or something like that would be willing to come on the show and talk to us about like Norse paganism and Norse mythology and everything as well, after you kind of set the groundwork and everything, to like fill in any of the gaps, because I feel like that would be interesting.
I know a couple people that kind of loosely follow it, but I don't. Well, actually, my one friend, he might, because he's talked about his sister a lot and how she's, like, very much into a lot of that.
Yeah, I know a couple people as well, but I don't know if I know them well enough to have them on the podcast or not. It's just kind of more in passing. But anyway, that's an idea for a future podcast. Kind of emphasize the fact that we're not afraid of, even though we're coming from a Christian perspective, we're not afraid of other ideas, and to explore wisdom and knowledge in all of its sources and forms here.
Mm-hmm.
We are not afraid of logic. We are not going to out-logic ourselves out of our faith.
Yeah. Now, if the other people are afraid of logic, well, we can't speak for them.
Yeah, no. Anyone that's afraid of logical discourse should have turned off the podcast the first 30 seconds in when I did that intro. So we should be good. We should have dedicated seekers of truth at this point. Maybe interdimensional philosophers as well. I don't know. Well,
maybe those philosophers are interdimensional in themselves.
You're just blowing my mind now, man. All right. You need to take off that shroom ban so that you stop having all these weird, crazy, abstract ideas. All right. Well, any final thoughts here, Trace, before I wrap up?
No, I think we're done here.
All right. Well, as always, it's been a pleasure being your host for this show. If you want to get a hold of us, you can find us on social media. We have Instagram and TikTok. That handle is m.quad.musings. The dot is periods, so it's not DOT, it's just a period. m.quad.musings. You type in Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix into Facebook. You can find our page there as well. And finally, you can get a hold of us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. And that's the exact same as our Instagram and TikTok handle, just at gmail.com. Thanks for joining us.